All right, here we go with Chapter 8, the Ready opening. This is a popular opening for players that like to play tricky move orders with d4 and c4, and also players that like to play g3 and go into like a King's Indian attack. This is actually one of my favorite moves to play for white, knight f3. So what
Yeah,
should we do?
I was just gonna say, do you know any players like that, Matt?
No.
I know you played the ready a lot. Yeah, very sneaky move opening. Matt likes to play with these like subtle move order things and get people super uncomfortable. So let's figure out how to completely neutralize what Matt wants to do. I like d5 here a lot. It seems like a lot of times they're going for a fianchetto in the ready line, and this is already kind of shutting that down. So I play d5 myself all the time. And we're going to look at two moves here. c4, getting kind of into an English position, and g3, also potentially transposing to an English. So I guess, is c4 technically in English here, or is...
I think it's a little more of like an anti-Slav, because if white starts c4, you don't usually get the d5 in so quickly, unless it's going to go into like a Slav or Queen's Gambit declined.
Okay.
So let's start with g3. G3 is kind of the most common move order. Anything d4, which could be played, is going to transpose to previous chapters. So g3, this is the King's Indian attack, and we're going to go for a solid line here. And Jesse kind of already mentioned this, that bishop's coming on g2. It's going to hit this pawn chain, and we're going to kind of hope to shut that bishop down because it's just hitting pawns that are defended by other pawns. And I think it's also one of the strongest defenses against the King's Indian.
Yep, I agree. I like lining up these pawns to kind of neutralize that bishop as well as we can. So white's probably going to fianchetto, bishop g2, and bishop g4. So there's a couple moves you can play here. I play bishop f5 quite a bit, but bishop g4 is kind of spicy too, because if we can trade this bishop for this knight, it's actually not so bad in a lot of positions because this is our weak bishop, and this is a very bad bishop for white too. So just kind of like keep that in mind. It's not the worst trade in the world to go for that.
Yeah, and I was going back and forth between those two moves, which to recommend. I think they're both equally good. I think the reason I ended up choosing this is just because of that extra attack on the f3 knight and also kind of this pin against the d1 queen if white tries to play e4. So that's sort of why I decided, but they're both definitely good options. So we've got three moves here for white after bishop to g4. Castling, which is by far the most common, because usually white will just play those four moves in a row no matter what. And then we'll also look at d3 and knight e5. So let's start with castling, the autopilot move. And we're going to go knight to d7. And what I want to do here is I want to play a quick e5. That's the plan. So I'm trying to grab some space and say, okay, we have the imbalance advantage with the space. White needs to prove that they have something to counter that imbalance, and having one extra move in development is not going to be enough, so white has to figure out a way that they can counter in the center. So let's start with the most common reply, pawn to d3. Here I'm recommending knight f6, and after knight d2, e5. So what do you think about this position?
Yeah, so grabbing a lot of space and kind of exploiting the fact that white kind of played on the flank here. So knight f3, g3, bishop out. They only have one center pawn moved, and it's only on the third rank. So e5 here is very thematic and very principled, just like claiming a big center. So very simple ideas. This is like chess 101 here.
And then the next thing we're going to go for is another strategic idea. After e4, d takes e. So I'm recommending this because it's simple to play. D takes e. And now, what do you think about this bishop on g2?
Bishop on g2 is looking quite sad. Staring into its own pawn, and then if its own pawn moves, now it's looking into even more of our own pawns, more of our pawns.
Yeah,
So that capture there kind of forced white to box in their bishop even more. If they would have taken with the knight, I assume we take with the knight and have the same idea without the knights on the board.
that's right. Yep. So we're always going to try to make that g2 bishop bad.
Yep. We can continue with bishop e7. And what are the numbers on this position, Matt?
Black wins 48% to 42% for white in the club database. So slight advantage black.
Gotta love it. Gotta have the like everyone drink because we added in the winning percentage. That's what you get with chess goals. I love it.
There should be like, you can't see the capture right now, but there should be something above my head where it shows like at all times the stats, and then maybe like
Yeah.
edit it when it's really high and flashing and everything. So
I like that idea.
h3 for white, and we're going to play bishop back to h5. If the bishop gets kicked back to g6, not bad at all, because that's going to put an extra attacker on this pawn on e4. So now white's most likely to play queen e2. This is a very common idea in the King's Indian. White wants to put the rook on d1 on the open file. So we're going to castle. After the most common move g4, we're dropping our bishop back. And now if white plays knight to h4, this is kind of a strong idea. It's looking at potentially getting the bishop pair, but also potentially putting the knight on f5 and just planting it there where we don't necessarily want to take. My recommendation is knight to c5, and what we're doing here is we're triple attacking the e-pawn, but we're also looking to do the same thing ourselves and put our knight into f4.
Two very sneaky knight maneuvers. You just assume white's going to capture here, black can capture here, but really maybe we're going for these squares.
Yes, and now taking on g6 is an inaccuracy for white. Having that bishop pair does not help white because of this bad bishop on g2. So in a locked position, you don't always want the bishop pair. So we're going to look at the stronger move, knight f5. Our recommendation is queen c7, opening up the square for the rook. And again, we're okay with this trade because that's our bad bishop. Go ahead and take e7 if you would like. Rook e1, and now knight e6. And here's our plan. Bishop on c5, nicely targeting f2. Rook f to e8, rook a to d8. The bishop may drop back to f8 instead of c5. It could go either direction. And then we want to play pawn to h5, chipping away at these kingside pawns for white. So this is a position where it looks very equal, but I really like the small imbalance differences, specifically this bishop on g2. And I think we have better winning chances than white, which was kind of matched in the database. Just, we talked like 48 to 42. And if you look at Stockfish here, it's about a 3/10 pawn advantage for black as well. So just very slight edge for black, and this is very simple to play, so we don't see a ton of ready or King's Indian attacks. We have a simple system to get a small edge.
Yep, I like that. And I think we've played all very normal, natural-looking moves, so hopefully we're not taking you into any strange, crazy territory. I wanted to mention, too, that if our knight gets planted here, we have the same principle in that we don't really want to take their bishop since it's such a bad piece. So we'll just have it sit here as long as they let us.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Don't do what we just said not to do for whites. All right, let's go back to move 5. We just looked at d3. Now let's look at d4. So white realizes we're going for this e5 push, and they're going to try to shut it down with d4, almost transposing it into a Catalan type structure. But this is definitely not a Catalan with this bishop on g5 and more of a Slav setup. No pawn on e6 yet. So here, since we can't play e5, we are going to recommend e6, which is, I'm calling a triangle with the bishop outside the pawn chain. All right, Jesse, so Catalan player, what are you going to play here?
Yeah, probably c4. And it's a very thematic move. We're not really, as black, we're not afraid of this move or anything like that. So c4, a nice move, landing up the c3 square for the knight without blocking your own pawn. So we can play knight f6, knight gf6 to be precise, knight c3, and here we're going to take the pawn. So this is something I dread as a Catalan player because you never know when you're supposed to give up the pawn, when you can capture it back. And actually here, it's not so easy to win it back.
Yeah, I agree with you. If we would have took a couple moves ago, there was knight to d2 very quickly, which would win the pawn back. But in this case, what happens after knight d2 here? Knight to b6, that's right, because we already got our knight out on d7. So what we're showing in this case is a4 for white. So kind of trying to prevent b5 ideas, round this pawn up later. And our recommendation is pawn to a5. And this is very common in the Slav. You'll see in the mainline Slav, you'll see things like this where you take c4, these pawns both get up. But in the Slav, white has the bishop ready to take c4. White does not have anything attacking the c4 pawn here. That's a big difference. So now white needs to play in the center. That's how they're going to try to get an advantage. Pawn to e4. And this is a bit shaky though. So what are we recommending in this position?
And yeah, so we can see, just kind of like take a quick inventory of potential weak points. Both of these pawns are potentially a little weak, and the b2 pawn is a little weak too. So if we play queen b6, we're kind of eyeing up these pawns and temporarily disabling this bishop from getting developed. So annoying move, to say the least. And so, yeah, just like kind of poking, prodding, and being annoying here. It's like our favorite move to play. We play queen b6 in like all our courses.
Yes, we do. I like it. The more I look at it, the more I realize that black scores very well in queen b6 lines. So the strongest move for white, pawn to h3. And now we mentioned this a little bit in the last line. We have this option to take f3. That's our recommendation here. Because after bishop takes, we're going to play this thematic idea, pawn to e5, trying to lock in this bishop behind the pawn on e4. Now, this pawn on e5 is not defended by another pawn. So like, let's say white takes here. They could attempt to try to free this e-pawn, but this is actually a mistake after knight takes e5. I'm not going to go too deep in this line, but white has a 1.5 pawn advantage according to the engine because we have this, we have rook d8, we have the d3 square. Not a good idea for white. So here we're going to show the best move for white, pawn to d5. And in this position, bishop to c5, eyeing this nice pawn on f2. And our plan is to castle, put a rook on d8. And if bishop g5 is played, we're going to kick it out with h6. And we're going to play in the center. And I think we have a nice clear advantage here. We're up a pawn, and I don't see anywhere near a pawn worth a comp for white.